Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan and all views respectfully stated are welcomed here. Our podcast is unique in that we blend the energy and passion of our student interns with the insights and wisdom that come from experienced professionals. Our focus is on problem solving, not finger pointing.
Hello and welcome to Allow Us to Explain. My name is Delaney Dickey and I am a podcast intern here at Our National Conversation. In light of the two recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action concerning the University of North Carolina and Harvard University, we will be discussing affirmative action in higher education. So let's start with our guest, Ronald Sullivan Jr.
So as you stated, I teach at the Harvard Law School, where I'm the faculty director of the Harvard Criminal Justice Institute and the Harvard Trial Advocacy Workshop. I teach criminal law, criminal procedure, and trial practice in the main. Every now and again, I'll teach a course in legal ethics. Also maintain a very small practice, taking 2 or 3 cases a year to keep my trial muscles sharp. And I've been at Harvard, I'd say 16 years now.
Now moving on to the introduction of our interns.
My name is Jay. I'm a rising senior at the University of Kansas, majoring in political science with minors in public policy and communications.
My name is Silas. I studied history first, then I started practicing law. I come from Brazil. I have similar to a master's in public advocacy. So I'm here joining the team of infrastructure. I'm a proud member and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me here.
Hey, how's it going? So I am a senior at FSU. I have a bachelor's in political science, currently acquiring my second bachelor's in sociology. Yeah, just here today to join in with the podcast to talk about policies that pertain to admissions for college, to enhance a better understanding of inclusivity for people of marginalized groups overall for higher education, and just happy to be here.
And so by creating affirmative action, it sort of puts people of color on an equal playing field with white students and allows students of color the opportunities that they may not receive by typical college admissions policies due to socioeconomic factors or something that would sort of impact their admissions, if that makes sense.
So overall, though, initially it was established to include inclusivity for the labor market for the most part, but over time it expanded towards higher education as well. Is the important thing to acknowledge, at least. So
the first mention of affirmative action came in the 1800s during the Reconstruction era, around 1862 or so through 65. But what we currently understand to be affirmative action came about in the 60s, first in the employment context and next in the higher education context.
Let's go over some decisions that set the precedent for this ruling.
So for precedents, at least, most of it encompasses around the 14th Amendment. Most of it is entitled through the Equal Protection Clause, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. We see Supreme Court cases, like I said, Gratz v. Bollinger. We also see in 2013 the University of Texas case as well. So most of it pertains to, for instance, I'll pull up University of Michigan at least. So within context, racial preferences undergraduate admissions is mostly most of what we're talking about. For instance, with Gratz v. Bollinger 2003, the major issue within this Supreme Court case is, did the University of Michigan's use of racial preferences undergraduate admissions violate Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Within this specific case, the University of Michigan's Office of Undergraduate Admissions considered a number of factors in its evaluative process, such as high school grades, standardized test scores, curriculum strength, alumni relationship geography, and also within this, they admit considering race as a main factor. beginning in 1998, the OUA used a point system which students were awarded an additional 20 points for being a member of an underrepresented minority. In this instance, the plaintiffs argued that they were denied admission due to this point system. We also see this within the University of Texas with their, I think it was their 10-point system, which admits the top 10% of high school within their public high schools. So like the top 10% of their high school individuals who admitted to the University of Texas were like basically granted access immediately, but they were denied their access due to for representation of minority groups. So the biggest issue at hand here is in drawing this towards the student for admission to be president and fellows of Harper College. We need to relay the fact that is it appropriate for admissions for colleges to utilize race or quotas to enhance minority groups within their programs, and whether or not it is to the benefactor or whether or not it is utilizing reverse discrimination to whether or not it is basically enhancing reverse discrimination to this factor that we are implementing these policies, basically.
So the main court case was brought by the Students for Fair Admissions, which is a more conservative group, and their goal is, as the name says, fair admissions processes for college students. And in the case of Harvard, they felt that Asian American applicants were being deferred and given unfair treatment in favor of their white counterparts. And so they brought the suit against affirmative action. They said that in Harvard's case in particular, that their use of affirmative action is not compelling enough and there's no set criteria. And so the Supreme Court actually ruled in their favor, effectively striking down affirmative action. Part of it was in the Supreme Court opinion. It basically just said that there's not exact criteria as to how race-based admissions work. And it does pick and choose. And they didn't believe that it was constitutionally sound under the Equal Protections Clause in the Constitution of the 14th Amendment. And by violating this Equal Protection Clause, it basically says that people aren't receiving equal treatment. And so affirmative action, therefore, was sort of shut down.
So Professor Sullivan, as someone that works for an institution, what do you think about this decision?
The opinion itself, I think, unfortunately, ignored some 50 years of precedent in reaching the decision. And I also thought there was an ironic version to the decision, and it's this. Justice Roberts articulated what he and others believe to be a colorblind theory of constitutional law under the Equal Protection Clause. It's an irony because the Equal Protection Clause itself was not colorblind. It was a color-conscious amendment during the Reconstruction era. So the majority would have us believe that a color-conscious amendment to the Constitution intends to be colorblind. So it's sort of an irony that the conservative wing, which considers itself to be historicist in nature, originalism and these sorts of things, ignore the original intent and ignore the history in order to produce a result that is consistent with their beliefs on racial justice generally. So I think that the decision is flawed in several respects, and I think it's going to have a deleterious impact on our schools. So I teach at Harvard, obviously, and there I do believe that there is an affirmative benefit to having a diverse set of ideas and people in front of you. I like to use an example that generally is non-controversial, but let's say that you have a school that has 100 seats in the class, and the top 99 scores are all prospective physics majors. I just don't think that's going to be a particularly interesting class, right? And this is nothing to say nothing about physics majors, but it's to say you don't want all physics majors there. You want people who believe that there are different accounts of reality. Some may be phenomenalists, believe the phenomenal world describes reality, but others might think that poetry, for example, describes reality in a different sort of way. And you have the combination and clash of these sorts of ideas, because in the end, this education that you young people are getting is all about what it means to be a human being. I mean, that's the endeavor that you're going through, trying to figure this out. And I just think a broad-based class does it better. Is affirmative action perfect? No. So if there is a silver lining to this opinion, I think it's going to force us to rethink the dimensions of affirmative action. And maybe later in the conversation, we'll talk about what those dimensions may be.
A question to Professor Ron. If you see, I record that there was some debate related to this case, to the very concept of diversity. We even have justices asking, what does diversity mean, or what is diversity? I mean, the simple question would be, is there diversity, or what is the meaning of diversity? But I believe that the real question behind that is the technical definition of diversity, or if there would be any standard that everybody could agree, and maybe this would be relevant to the discussion. I'd like to hear your take on this very specific point.
That's a great question. So what the majority said was, well, this notion of a diverse class is sort of too squishy for us to understand, right? It's vague, it's ambiguous. How in the world will a court measure whether diversity does what it says it's going to do? That is, produce the sorts of debates that I talked about, right? Or produce the sort of citizens that go into the world, and particularly into elite corporate America. And let's just be frank about this. This whole fight is over seats at very elite universities. That's the only thing that people are really litigating about, because these are these sort of easy pathways to elite corporate America and so forth, and big money, and so that's what's at stake here, these seats. And so the court says that, look, we don't even know whether it works. So if someone were to bring a case back and say, well, diversity failed, we'd have no metrics really to measure this thing on. And whether you agree or disagree with that depends fundamentally on what you take to be the reach and the responsibility of the court. So a very conservative view of the court, as articulated in some of the Federalist Papers, is that the court is the weakest of the three branches of government, that it only decides cases and controversies very narrowly. And the sort of issue that you just described will be the issue that's what just called non-justiciable. That's a political question, not a question that is before the judges. You folks out there figure that out, whether it's working or not. Our only goal is to decide whether the initial question before us is constitutional. Now, people with a broader view of the reach of the court will say, well, they are right, that in order to decide the dimensions of the Constitution, the reach of the Constitution, these are the very sorts of questions that the court has to ask. Now, it was answered, not to the majority's satisfaction, in all the many amici briefs that came before the court. And for your audience, amicus briefs, it's a Latin word for friend of the court. There were dozens of, and the plural is amici. I hate to use Latin, so sorry, but that's what they're called. Amici briefs came before the court. And corporate institutions, universities, the military, et cetera, all attempted to answer that question and said that, yes, it is measurable. Here are the measures, and this is why it's working. Now, Justice Roberts interestingly said that, well, we're going to exclude the military from this ruling because they have different interests. So it appears that he believes, or the majority believes, that there's some way it is possible to conceive of measuring diversity, because he thought the military did it sufficiently well to be excluded from this form of constitutional scrutiny. But I think it all depends on what your view is of the power of the court.
Let's talk more about the importance of affirmative action. Affirmative action can be traced to the civil rights movement, as it helped racially diversify education and workspaces around the country. It also is linked to the feminist movement, which allows women, mostly white women, to get jobs in fields that are dominated by men. Due to the controversies in the way in which it diversifies the workforce, as well as higher education, affirmative action has been subject to numerous Supreme Court cases. In the most recent Supreme Court case happening late last month, the ruling that affirmative action in college admissions violates the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Some people that are against the Supreme Court decision and support affirmative action argue that systems like higher education were not meant to be inclusive. For example, legacy enrollees, in which a university prioritizes those applicants which strip away the opportunities for those that are less fortunate. On the other hand, the people that support the Supreme Court decision believe that when looking at college admissions, the primary focus should be on those applicants who are the right fit for that university, as well as the applicants that have shown success and promise in academics. According to a poll by ABC News, most Americans, 52%, approve of the recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. Where does the practice of affirmative action now stand in the U.S.?
It is highly questionable in the university context. I think that universities, the elite universities, the ones that really are the subject of this, are going to push back on this opinion. That is, they're going to think of creative ways to continue admitting the sort of class that they have always admitted. And that's going to lead to another decade or so of litigation, and it'll work its way back up to the Supreme Court. An interesting question is the extent to which like government contracting and those sorts of set-aside programs are going to be impacted by this decision. Again, there are going to be any number of decisions that, or any number of challenges that come up through the district courts and courts of appeals, and will ultimately work its way up to the Supreme Court. So, in a word, I would say tenuous.
I'm totally for the fact that I'm an immigrant. I tend to check the debates, the domestic debates, but also try to keep an eye on the international aspect of the debate, right? I agree completely with Professor Ron when he says that we are going to probably have lots of litigation in the future. And I also believe that the secret formula for this problem lies on the limits of policymaking. So it's not necessarily a matter of adopting the conservative solution or adopting the liberal solution for the case, because, you know, conservative turns and liberal turns, they keep happening in a process, in a historical process. So this is going to keep changing from decade to decade. I personally believe that a good conversation could start if we were like trying to find the common ground to establish good policies that are gonna have, I don't know, 80% of matters that everybody can agree. Because I believe even people who are against affirmative actions, they can admit that we live under great disparities and great inequalities that affect the racial groups and minorities differently. So a good start would be, hey, what do we agree? And let's try to craft some policy making that makes sense.
We'll bring up the question then, Professor, as of now, do you think the effectiveness of affirmative action has been productive within the past 50 or 60 years to challenge the status quo for marginalized groups?
First question, it has been productive for some subset of marginalized groups. I think white women have benefited the most, and second, middle-class African Americans. For poor African Americans, hasn't had the impact that was intended. So earlier I said, I think that if there is a silver lining, it might allow us to rethink the contours and dimensions of affirmative action to include some sort of socioeconomic aspect into the analysis as part of an algorithm that spits out whether one is eligible for some form of reference, some sort of racial preference.
What do you think would be the inherent challenge? From my perspective, I would say class. Most socioeconomic status would be the inherent flaw that the institutions need to challenge mostly. But I think thus far, the premise has been race, obviously, specifically going about, obviously because of the influence of the Civil Rights Act of, just due to the Civil Rights Initiative back in the mid-1960s. Would you agree with that, or would you apply a different perspective on the analysis of like where admissions should like adhere to?
Yeah, so for me, it would be some sort of mix of race and class, and that would determine eligibility for these sorts of programs to the extent that some future courts will allow it at all. So class has to be an important aspect of it. Lonnie Guinier, my former colleague at Harvard, wrote a book some years ago. The name is escaping me, but they did a quantitative analysis of this notion of merit, how people score on tests, how people do in school. And she said it correlates most to this, the W-2 of the student's parents. That's the best predictor of how they're going to do on these tests and how they're going to do in the early years of college. And I say early years because people do tend to catch up, those who are behind a little, and it kind of toward the end sort of evens out. But so the influence of class has a lot to do with it. And I'm not saying it's going to be an easy algorithm to come up with, but it's certainly worth the work of it. Another thing we've learned from the SAT test is that they are normed to white, mid to upper class applicants. How do we know that? Because every year there are a number of test questions, and this will be amusing to you. There are a number of test questions that they put on the exam, the ones that are not graded, but they just want to see how people do. And let's say question 15 was one of these test questions. If too many white middle class, white upper middle class miss number 15, and let's say that minority and poor people overperform on number 15, the answer, the result, what the test writers learn from that is there's something wrong with question 15, and they throw it out, right? And because, well, that doesn't make sense to them, because that it shouldn't be. And what it shows is that, even today, there are some small biases that are baked into these sorts of exams. And it doesn't have anything to do with native. These tests are written in a way that prejudices poor people and poor Black people. So, you've got to come up with something that accounts for the real world and the way that the real world interacts on the life chances of minority populations. And I think that we can, as I think it was Silas who said earlier, I think that we can, through conversations like this, come up with something. If there's a political will to do it, then I think that we can do it if we have robust, civil, engaged dialogue on an issue where in the end it's going to benefit all of us as a citizenry.
Legislatively speaking, within the recent couple of months, there has been talks of legislation that is aims to dissuade universities of enacting policies of prefer certain initiatives that prefer legacy admissions. I was going to ask though, from your perspective, do we think that affirmative action has been a consistent deferrent of legacy admissions throughout the past couple of decades, or has it failed at least to just curtail any like schools to partake in these admission practices?
What underwrites a lot of the objection to affirmative action is this notion that quote unquote unqualified people are coming to this school. How dare they let unqualified people into this school where qualified people are not getting in? That's problematic on at least two registers. The first is that there are more qualified people than spaces at all of these elite institutions. And we know that after a certain cutoff score in the SAT, and though those folk can and will perform, they can do the work and they will if admitted. But it's more of those people than spaces. So schools have to come up with some kind of way to fill the seats. And so there are qualified people, no matter what regime you're going to use, that will not get into these schools. The math just does not work. Second, if folks are serious about this question of meritocracies and quality and unquality and so forth, one of these issues is legacy admission. Another are sports, right? And and there are some schools in this country you better not talk about their sports program. That's off the table, right? Off the table, right? Because they bring in millions and millions and millions of dollars to these universities every year. And all right, let's pull those grades. Let's pull those test scores. I happen to know the data there because I was involved in one of these varsity blues-like cases as a lawyer, not as an offender. Very much lower than the norm, these scores. And in addition to legacy, there's one more. There's something called various things in various places called a dean's list. And it's like, hey, the dean or the president has a certain number of spots, and she can fill those spots or he can fill those spots as the dean or president sees fit. And it's usually the children of very high donors. So, if we want to have a real conversation about meritocracies, then get rid of legacies and athletic admissions and that sort of thing. Now, I was a student athlete. I think athletes bring a lot to the school. And on what I said earlier, a whole class of physics majors would not be interesting. A whole class of people who don't do athletics would probably not be interesting. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just saying let's not have selective outrage when schools have been doing this for a very, very long time.
Looking at socioeconomic status for admissions, I think it's extremely important. Because looking at the college admissions process now, it's just gotten so competitive. Even nowadays, just having a 4.0 GPA and honors isn't enough. You need extracurriculars, you need volunteering, you need clubs, you need some sort of experience, jobs, and people in disadvantaged groups who may not have access to that, even though they may have a 4.0 GPA, they'll still get turned down because they just didn't have the access. So I guess that sort of leads into my question is, now that it's sort of been proven in court that affirmative action policies can be argued, litigated, and overturned, do you think that there is any sort of future where we can have affirmative action policies or sort of similar things where socioeconomic status, stuff like that, is taken into consideration? Or will there now always be some sort of court case fighting it at every single turn?
I think that we can and ultimately will. In the majority opinion, while Justice Roberts said that race cannot be used as a factor to determine admission, he stated that an applicant can talk about her race in a way that to describe how that affected her life. And to the extent that that story talks about individual character, courage, stick-to-itiveness, etc., then that can be used, right? So this is going to be the next sort of battle I anticipate, because people are going to write essays consistent with that opinion, right? That's no secret. I mean, this has been all over the news. So what I take Justice Roberts to be saying is that race cannot be used systematically. That means everybody with a B or an H beside their name doesn't get a point. But rather, if an individual can make an individual case about the way in which race has impacted their chances. So Jay, to say, hey, I couldn't afford the bus ride over to the fancy summer program, so I had to work at the market, whatever the case is, and that's why my resume may look a little different than most you see. As I read the opinion, that is compelling, right? So in the same way, if I read, I've read applications where people are, have gone to cancer treatment in the morning and class in the afternoon and then work after school. And I'm like, my goodness, that tells me something about this individual. And they still have high grades, et cetera. That tells me about this individual. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm actually very serious about this. I am very glad that I'm not going to school with your generation now. You're right about what's on these resumes. So I was a lifeguard on the beach my junior year summer of high school, senior year summer, freshman college, sophomore college. I don't know if I would have gotten into the Harvard Law School nowadays with that, because people are founding NGOs and have 17 employees all by the time they're 17 years old. It's remarkable. I don't know how you guys do have the time to do it, but I'm glad I got in when I got in.
It's way too expensive now. That's the biggest thing. It's way too expensive now.
Right. Just want to inform that I got this article from Zachary Bleemer, Affirmative Action and its Race-Neutral Alternatives, where he basically analyzed California case, because California banned the affirmative actions 25 years ago in 1998. So there's a lot of data to compare the impact of affirmative actions in California, University of California, affirmative actions, top percent policies, and holistic reviews. And data showed that affirmative action increased underrepresented minority enrollment by over 20%, while top percent policies increased URM, underrepresented minorities enrollment, by 4%, and holistic review increased URM enrollment by about 7%. So the criteria not only matters, but also we have a problem here, because what at least at the case of California University, the University of California showed that is that if you remove affirmative actions as a policy, you're gonna have very hardly achieve reasonable effects or a result that's close to the effects of affirmative action. So it's not only a matter of blending the new policies, whatever they are, but also it will require a lot of study to find the right criteria to replace something like that. I'm just afraid that just replacing affirmative action for a top percent policy in general is going to be very, very harmful for the country.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's definitely what the data show in the short run, that there's a precipitous drop off in the number of Black and brown folk getting into schools in these states that have already banned affirmative action. But under the, full stop. Next thought, under the states as laboratories of democracy theory, right? We have to pick from each of these states various programs and put them together and see how they work and what happens. But you got the top percent. You've got, I can't remember if it's California or Texas, but one of those states took the valedictorians, said we will accept any valedictorian from any school across the country, and I'm sorry, across the state, and that would include the jurisdictions that are majority Latino, majority African American, and that was a way to attract a diverse student body. And there are other mechanisms. I'm not as versed on that as people who study admissions and who do admissions, but I think that we have to take the best from what these states have learned, and I suspect that admissions in many places will attempt to do that. Now, there are states here where, based on both law and disposition, I don't think they're going to undertake those efforts at all. And what we will see is a tremendous drop in the number of students of color in these institutions. And I think that's just not good for the country.
Have you pondered a sufficient alternative just on your own downtime?
What I do know as a teacher, before I taught at Harvard, I taught at Yale. So it was like 16 years at Harvard, and I think 3 years at Yale. So almost 20 years teaching at graduate schools in the U.S. And there is a benefit, and it's tangible. And I've never done a study to measure it, but it's tangible to have different ideas competing and clashing, and in a civil way. It makes everybody better. It makes the subject matter richer. It has certainly influenced me as an intellectual. I am sure just generations of students, and I would hate that to be lost.
How are social group positions and standings in both the workplace and higher education fields going to be affected in a post-affirmative action world?
I'm definitely interested in seeing how the demographics in higher education change after this ruling. I suppose probably starting with fall 2024 admissions, seeing what schools work proactively to still try to create diverse populations, and which schools we can sort of see used affirmative action as sort of a requirement. And then now that that's gone, they don't have to enroll as many diverse populations of students. So I'm really curious to see just how the numbers are going to change.
No, I think that's the correct observation. There will be a significant number of schools who will be relieved and say we don't have to do this anymore. And I think that'll be reflected in the numbers. And you're right, that's just a datum point that we'll have to wait and see what happens. In terms of the sort of standing question, if I understand the question, so one of the things Justice Thomas says is that other students look at minority students differently because they think they got into the school on lower numbers, right? And according to Justice Thomas and people who share his viewpoint, that not only has an impact on the other students because they think that minority students are not sufficiently qualified, but it has a psychological impact on the minority student himself or herself, because they come away with essentially an inferiority complex, thinking that they don't belong, etc. If that's what you mean, if that's what the question means by standing, I just, I sharply disagree with Justice Thomas on that. It could be that's how he felt, and I don't begrudge him that. I don't know if we should make constitutional policy based on the idiosyncratic psychological disposition of individual justices. In terms of what other people think, my view is who cares? So that's my approach, and that's how I raise my children. Life is too short to worry about what other people are thinking about you and all of that business. So what will be the standing after affirmative action if proponents of the dismantling of affirmative action thinks the result is going to be racial utopia? I think that's wrong. Time will tell, and if I'm proven wrong, I'll come back here and say I was wrong. But I think we will see the same sort of shenanigans that we see now in this post-affirmative action world.
Justice Thomas tends to take a victimization approach for minority groups when it comes to the affirmative action. If I stand corrected, I think that comes from his personal preference, but experience overall. They have a very distinct approach, or at least perspective, when it comes to minorities and their integration within not just emissions, but within society overall. I mean, in my opinion, I could see it. I would say the status quo could firmly stand for the most part. There are some universities, for instance, trying to abolish the legacy preferences. So I could definitely see some universities also taking note of that and trying to virtue signal in order to set some sort of appeasement towards their admissions applicants overall. For the most part, it's kind of hard to dissect the trajectory of where things could go. I guess it just kind of comes down to it's almost like laboratories of democracy, but for like universities on their own. It just depends on like the admission processes per university and how stringent they want to adhere towards their policies for the most. But for me personally, I don't really know if like the status quo will change that much. The question is whether or not we legislatively speaking, apply certain policies that will expand on what affirmative action try to enlist for the most part. That is the question. If anything is going to get passed via law that will expand and just really try to, I guess, interject the socioeconomic conditions of certain applicants and their ability to get admits to certain like institutions.
I think I would agree with that. I'm looking through the opinion now, and of course I can't find what I was looking for, but Justice Thomas and Justice Sotomayor had a little back and forth about when you said whether universities are going to slavishly attend to the opinion or whether use that part of Justice Roberts' opinion in order to still take race into consideration, even indirectly as a proxy of courage, etc. And Justice Roberts kind of fired back and said, I don't think it's good. It would be good lawyering for someone to rely on the dissenting opinion to determine whether they are in conformity with the majority opinion.
Do you think it's appropriate to even consider race, gender, disability, etc., within the admissions process whatsoever?
Do I? Yes, I do.
You do? Okay. I'm just curious. I'm just genuinely just curious.
So what solutions can colleges and universities do to help retain that diverse population on their campus?
Well, I just think they have to be intentional. I wouldn't presume to give them the tools because, again, I don't do admissions in that sense. I actually sit on the faculty admissions committee at Harvard, but all I do is read applications. I don't put classes together in the way admissions officers do. But I think that they just should be intentional about what sort of classes they want to have. And I think it benefits us all if we have varying perspectives before us. And, look, some institutions may not believe that, and ultimately the quality of the graduate will determine that, because companies and businesses and institutions into which these graduates go, are ambassadors to the school. And if these entities start seeing differences among different sorts of graduates of universities, some better, some worse, then the market has a way of working these things out ultimately.
I would also add, I think, another solution is looking at the demographics of admissions boards as well. There's the concept of similarity bias, where you tend to seek out people that are similar to you in terms of skin color, background, education, stuff like that. So, for example, if you have an admissions board of 10 people and they're all, upper middle class white men, then the admitted population will probably reflect that. So making sure that admissions boards have people of color, have people from underrepresented groups, to make sure that the admissions sort of reflect that.
Yeah, similarity bias is an interesting phenomena because it's unconscious. The actors don't realize that they're engaging in it. There's been a lot of work at the and some very good articles at the Harvard Business School, and for the most part, business schools aren't thinking about social experiments, et cetera. They're thinking about how to make money. But it turns out descriptively that business owners hire people who look like them. So if you ever walk into a Black business, you're going to see more Black employees, or Asian business, woman-owned business, white male-owned business, et cetera. Now, so these articles talk about this descriptively. This is what happens. What's underneath that is what you describe as a similarity bias, that people don't take themselves to be biased, but they're like, wow, now that's a fine young man there, right? And it's their own life experience at work. And so, yes, to the extent you have different sorts of people there, they might recognize different sorts of qualities, because people generally do not recognize their genuinely, I'm trying to say, do not recognize their own biases. Yale did this study. This is based on the rates of discipline for young Black boys in school. And the argument was that the same sort of conduct for a Black boy was determined as violating school rules, whereas for whites, it was, oh, he's precocious. So they did this study on bias. But when you tell people you're doing a study on bias, then people aren't going to be biased because they're going to be sort of thinking about, well, I'm not going to be biased. So they asked teachers to look at a video and write down each time they thought that a potential discipline problem was brewing. What they didn't know is that the researchers could care less what they were writing down because they were on notice that they weren't being biased. But the camera had this thing where they were watching their eyes. And the teacher's eyes, by an overwhelming disproportionate margin, went to the Black boy, right? Number 2, Black girl. Number 3, white boy. Number 4, white girl. But by a big margin, those eyes. And so if you're looking for it disproportionately, you're going to find it disproportionately. Now, these are very nice people. And I'm sure, not intending to do anything, but that's how our subconscious works. And one of the ways we need to root out those sorts of subconscious biases, right? And one way you can do that is by being around people who are different than you, right? And you begin to see that, well, there's not one mold. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. One benefit from there is I never had an inferiority complex. It was as if I grew up, in one of the, in the West Indies or something, right? On an island or something like that. And it's because I've never associated skin color with inferior traits, because I saw all types. Right, it was all Black. So the first time I went to a non-Black doctor was at the Harvard Law School, right? So I saw doctors, lawyers, preachers, pimps, criminals, smart people, dumb people, right? All with the same color. So I've never associated character with color. And the more we kind of mix in this country in a significant way, then we're going to break these sorts of associations. Devan, African-American scholar, premier scholar at UCLA. He's a law professor. He wrote an article where he came to the United States first time in college. He's Jamaican, but was raised in London. So it's a Black guy with a very nice British accent, and went to UCLA for the very first time. And what he saw on TV growing up in London, he writes about this, so I'm not sharing anything. He said he came here and had no intentions whatsoever of being Black as he saw it, because all he saw was gang banging and boys from the hood and all of this kind of stuff. But he writes an epilogue to an article where he says he was naturalized as Black American before he was naturalized as a citizen. And it had to do with repeated police stops when he first got here. And he was like, oh, wait, there is some performative aspect that I'm supposed to do here that I just didn't know, and realize that people were looking at him as a personification of a stereotype as opposed to an individual, because it just sort of shows how the way in which, subconscious works and sort of and pegs people. And then when they heard him talk, like the officer said, so where are you from? And he said, I live over at such and such, a student at UCLA. No, where are you from? And he said, London. Where are your parents from? Right? It's like, it just didn't quite fit. Just nothing fit. So, the thing is, the more we have interactions with each other, then we're going to learn that, in every culture, there's a sort of wide range of talents and individual dispositions, and we just can't let Hollywood define who we are, because these sorts of stereotypes are deleterious on a whole host of registers, and it's just not healthy.
I was going to say, for the most part, though, it's going to have to be tackled legislatively in order to combat any of these biases or any of these tendencies that institutions partake in. It started out legislatively speaking during the Civil Rights era. It's going to most likely have to be applied furthermore. Professor, you were the Fair College Admissions for Student Act. It's relatively new.
Yes.
Okay, so that's being applied at the moment, at least by representatives in Congress. I did find one interesting one, surprisingly, by the tax code. I'll read this one out real quick because I thought this was relatively interesting. This is kind of like just stamping it to institutions financially speaking. Via the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which placed a 1.4% tax on university endowment income for those universities with 500 or more students and endowment assets above 500,000 per student. According to the ERN report, 39 of the 44 universities and colleges meeting the threshold for the Endowment Act in the fiscal year of 2021 provided a legacy preference. So Congress can impose an additional tax on institutions that are subject to the endowment tax, basically, that provide a legacy preference. From my perspective, I can agree. I mean, I think I would even go higher than that. But overall, though, for the most part, it's going to have to be done legislatively speaking, because, like I said before, some of them can virtue signal and try to adhere towards the cultural shift of what is just, I guess. But overall, though, legislatively speaking, there's going to have to be some sort of reform that expands upon what affirmative action tried to set in place beforehand. Because initially speaking, I would say it was most likely a Band-Aid solution that was administered in the 60s, and obviously they weren't as progressive as things have tended to shift as they have now. So it just depends on the motivation that Congress has to really try to administer a solid solution. The problem is that, as we saw with polling, I mean, like 50%, it's like more like a 50-50 shift where people, African American communities care, but white Americans, Latinos kind of care. Asian Americans and white Americans, though, do not tend to be in solidarity with affirmative action. So it depends on the motivation, I guess you could say, that Congress would potentially have. Because I definitely don't believe that the universities themselves will genuinely try to apply policies that just propagate certain socioeconomic conditions over the others.
Yeah, I agree that any remediation is probably going to have to be legislative.
Gonna have to be.
This court and these margins will probably be in place the next 40 years, 30 years at least.
Agreed. I agree with that,
Justices are very young. I know they seem ancient to you guys, but for justices, they're very young. And
Kavanaugh, Barrett,
they've got great health care. They tend to live a very, very long time, and which is a good thing. And you get life with good behavior, as Justice Marshall used to say when people asked him when he started getting sick, are you going to retire? He said, I was appointed for life, and life means life. We'll have this court for a good long time. So I think that is the next area where sort of civil rights groups have to look into the legislature.
Just keeping in the field of solutions, Delaney's question was interesting, and Devan anticipate the first part of what I would say. I got no idea how the policy is going to look like to solve the problem, but I'm pretty sure, and I bet that's going to come from the appropriate branch of power. That is going to come from the legislator, not from the Supreme Court. But what I really would like to share is that even the legislator, he doesn't create anything that's different from society. The real solution is going to be born in the ecosystem of those organizations and people who are engaged in, study and test and experiment on representation and diversity. I'm talking here of think tanks and consulting firms and NGOs and impact investors, whatever. This might be a very good opportunity, as just like US has done in different matters over history, after a big backlash and after a big change of rule, an opportunity to sit, debate. That's one of the things this country does the best. Debate and come up with good ideas and implement something really big. Because I agree with Devan when he says that depending on the incentives that the legislator has for the short run, we might have more and more problems. If we keep having trouble for a lack of rule and bring it to the Supreme Court every time, we're going to have policies that are going to divide this country in very different seasons. And I mean, how can you trust your institutions when they keep changing all the time, right? So that could be maybe, I don't know, something to think about it. How can we start conversations? How can we develop like shared policies? How can we think in the very long run and come up with something that can last?
Thanks for listening to our podcast. Be sure to check out our next episode on Confederate name changes.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.